Hi, everyone. Thank you for choosing this very last session of the PDC. I hope you've had an enjoyable time. You've seen many interesting things. I certainly have. I'm very honored to speak here at the PDC. And really, thank you for coming. My name is Bertrand Leroy, but you can call me Bertrand if that's easier for you. I'm a program manager on the ASP .NET team, and I've been working on the AJAX project since its beginning. So what I'm going to show you today is what we are cooking for the next version of AJAX. So how many of you are currently users of Microsoft AJAX? Woohoo! How many of you are jQuery users? Fair number. Okay, so as most of you are users of AJAX, I won't spend too much time explaining what AJAX is. Apparently, most of you already know that. Still going to do it for a few of you who may not be familiar with it. I'll show you how Microsoft AJAX is typically used today. It doesn't mean that this is the way you should absolutely use it or that it's the only way you can use it today, but it's a pretty typical use of Microsoft AJAX today using update panels. I will also show you what I mean in the rest of the talk by pure AJAX. If you've seen Stephen Walter's talk, he's been talking about that in different terms. He's been talking about AJA with an H for HTML and AJAX with an X for XML, although most of the time there is no XML involved. It's really JSON. So maybe you should all start calling it AJAX, but that doesn't sound too good. And of course, I will introduce you with all the new features that we have in ASP.NET 4.0. And I'm really very proud of this release. I think we've come up with a really great model that will enable you to build end-to-end data applications using the client model. So the key takeaways I'd like you to get from this talk are that ASP.NET AJAX development is more active than ever. And that is a very important point because some of you may have been confused by the jQuery announcement, for example, which in no way means that we are abandoning the development of Microsoft AJAX. We have more developers than ever on that. And also that client data-driven UI is now easier than ever. So what is AJAX all about? Well, what AJAX is all about is that when you have a page using the traditional post-back model, what will happen is that every time the user does, well, anything, more than just click a checkbox, and even that can cause a post-back, you will have a post-back, which means that the page will stop being interactive while it's going back to the server, and the server is going to respond and give a completely new copy of the page that needs to be re-rendered. So that's a waste of resources. And it's a bad user experience because the interactivity of the application stops while this is going on. So AJAX is all about making these interactions with the user more fluid and to make them consume less network resources and resources in general. So the server AJAX model is probably the one that is the most common when you're using Microsoft AJAX today. That is what happens when you use update panel. So when you use update panel, you have the initial request that comes from the server, and that's HTML and some script. The user does something. So here it's the exact same model as a postback. And actually, if you take an update panel page, remove the update panel, most of the time the page works exactly the same. But in the case of update panel, instead of posting the whole page and getting the whole page back, you only have the form post, so that's the same. But what you get back is a fragment of HTML, and you replace parts of the page with that HTML. But still, the rendering is going on the server. So in the pure AJAX model, what travels over the wire for interactions after the first request, that is pure JSON on both sides. So you send a request to a web service using JSON, so it's a much smaller data packet, and what you get back is JSON. And here the rendering is going on the client. So this is what we're going to do today. So this pure AJAX model is perfectly feasible today with Microsoft AJAX, but let's face it, it's a pain. So today, update panel. So update panel is very, very convenient, and it's not going away anytime soon. It's still the most convenient way of taking an existing application and giving it some AJAX functionality by just surrounding the part of the page that you want to update with an update panel. So I've talked about the fact that you can already do pure client-side AJAX today, but at least the perception of Microsoft AJAX is really of a server-side focus. So it has update panel, it has server controls and extenders that kind of abstract the notion of client-side component behind the server-side concept. And this shields the developer from having to write JavaScript most of the time. So this may be a good thing in some situations. How many of you hate JavaScript? Well, the good news is it's a smaller percentage than the last time I asked this question. And I hope we can convince you that it can actually be quite a fun language to use. And there is actually one book I can recommend. Douglas Crockford recently wrote a book that's called JavaScript, The Good Part. So maybe if you hate JavaScript, that's a good place to go and read about the good part. So today the client-focused development is possible, but it's less familiar and it's more difficult. So the first demo I'm going to do here is that I'm going to show you a typical update panel page. So in this page, I have a script manager here. That's familiar. This is going to include all the scripts that you need. It's going to manage the update panel request. It's going to do a lot of things. And then I have an entity data source. So here I'm really in a server-side model. And then I have a list view. And this list view points to my entity data source. And then I have a template. And this template, and this is a concept that we'll see again and again, but on the client this time. So I have a layout template, and I have an item template. And inside of this item template, I have binding expressions, which enable me to just inject data into the markup. So this is what templating is all about. So here in this case, I have a master view, and I have a details view. And the details view here is inside of an update panel. So if we run this page, maybe I should sing a little song here while this is going on. All right. So actually, you didn't see anything happening, which is quite normal. So now I can select an item, and I can see the details here. And what happened when I click this select button is that a request. Oh, I can actually show you exactly what happened. If we go to the net panel here, we can see that there's been a post here to the page. And the post has this, how should I say that, horrendous, atrociously long piece of garbage. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. Well, actually, no. I mean, view state is not that bad. It's actually quite useful in some situations. You just have to know how to use it, and you have to know how to not use it. So, and actually, there are a few interesting things that we're doing in ASP.NET 4.0 web forms to improve on that and enable you to have smaller view state or even suppress it as much as possible. and still keeping all the functionality of the page running. But anyway, here I didn't do anything special to reduce the view state, and let's face it, it's horrible. And the page is not even that big. So I'm not saying that update panel is bad. It's actually very useful in many situations, and it has some advantages in terms of search engine optimization. But yeah. Oh, and here, what do we have here? Updated view state. So the view state goes back to the server, and it comes back from the server. So be careful when you use update panel. You have to keep in mind that this is still a postback going on. So the only thing that gets reduced here is the amount of HTML you get back from the server. But it's still pretty close to a regular postback. What you get is actually better interactivity and a little smaller HTML. And of course, one mistake you certainly don't want to make is put an update panel around your whole page. Don't laugh, I've seen that more often than I'd like to admit. Yeah, if you're into that sort of thing, you should probably go back to that old feature that we had that was called smart navigation. Do any of you remember that feature? Yeah, did you like it? Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, so that was update panel. So let's get back to the slides for a moment. So in the pure AJAX model, things are very different. You only get the data that you need, less round tripping. Network payload is way smaller. Data is always, well, most of the time smaller than JSON. But the first bullet point is really important. And actually, that's something I really wanted to talk about. One of the questions I got over and over again during this PDC is questions starting with, how do I choose between and? So how do I choose between Silverlight and AJAX? How do I choose between MVC and web forms? Stuff like that. So I hope I can give you some pointers. We want to give you choice, and we know that this choice can be confusing sometimes. Why would you choose AJAX over Silverlight, for example? Well, maybe you don't want a plugin. Maybe you want a purely standard-based application. Maybe you don't need all the bells and whistles of Silverlight. Or maybe you just like to program with standards. So it's really questions of the constraints that you have on your application. Of course, I would be more in favor of using AJAX because that's what I do. And that's actually a very important point. Do what you know. If I'm going to build an application tomorrow, I don't know Silverlight too well. I will probably be faster building it with AJAX. So do what you know. That usually works. So you may have noticed that in PDC we have two kinds of slides. We have the black slides, which stand for the past, and the blue slides, or should I say the azure slides, that are for the future. So here it's actually not a very far future, because actually everything I'm going to show you, you can do today by downloading the preview of ASP .NET AJAX. We've made it available on Monday, so you can download this from Codeplex. I'll show you at the end of the talk how you do that. So our goal with 4.0 is to make client-side applications very, very easy to develop. So this is a model where you get JSON from the server, not HTML, which means that you have an actual data object graph on the client that you can use and reuse. We have client data sources that enable you to get that data from the server and keep a reference to it. We have client template rendering, and I think that is the most important part in terms of rapid development. We have live bindings, which will enable very dynamic applications. So live bindings are, let's say that you have a text box and you have a label on a page, and this label has the same piece of information. When you modify the text box, you want the label to change immediately. If you try to do that with a server-based model, Well, you can't. You have to do a post back. Or you'll have to write script, but this is what we're doing here. And we have a declarative model to instantiate components. And this declarative model, as I'll show, is optional. If you don't like declarative programming, you don't have to. The client data. What's really important about that client data is that the structures that we use on the client are just plain JavaScript objects. And this is very important for many reasons. First, when the data comes back from the web service, it's not necessarily a Microsoft ASP.NET web service. It's just returning JSON. And JSON is just a pure data structure. It has no concept of methods or types or stuff like that. It's really just the built-in types of JavaScript. And we want to keep very close to that model where the data is just represented as a graph of data with nothing more. So we just use those arrays and objects as the data structures. You don't have concepts like data table or data set or stuff like that. We can use any kind of JSON web service. So when I say JSON web service, it's just a web service that returns JSON instead of XML, and that takes also JSON as a request. You can use an ASMX web service, which is certainly the easiest way you can build a web service in ASP.NET. You can use a WCF web service if you're more into the enterprise level kind of architecture of web services. You can use a plain HTTP handler. That's fine. So you can have a handler that takes some parameters from the query string, for example, and just returns a JSON string that you build on the fly. It can also use JSON results. So if you've used MVC, this is in MVC. In MVC, you can have a view that returns a JSON result, and the JSON result is just that. It's just pure JSON. So it's a very convenient way of having Microsoft AJAX interact with MVC. And you can interact with ADO.NET data services. ADO.NET data services are a REST kind of web service so it's a little higher level than web service. If you use a web service, you'll have to write the methods to read the data, to update the data, to insert data, delete data. In the case of an ADO.NET data service, you just point to a database and you're done. So I'll show you that actually. And the client-side data sources understand natively the ADO.NET data services, which is very convenient when you want to build a CRUD kind of application. So again, the server data will get represented on the client as plain JavaScript objects, so arrays and objects. Client templates. So templates are a familiar concept. You've been using them forever in ASP.NET, right? So here is an example on top of the slide. You can see an example of a very simple server template. So it has an LI element, and inside of that LI element, I'm just evaluating the name column of the current data item. So that's very simple. Well, on the client, it looks pretty much the same, except the notation is different for a number of reasons. These reasons having to do mainly with XHTML compliance. So here I have, we don't have the luxury here of having new elements, so we're reusing existing elements of HTML, and I'll come back to this notion later, which is that we're adding new semantics to an existing language. And what we have here is an LI tag with the name property of the current data item that's being bound to this LI. So it looks pretty much the same, and it's actually a little simpler on the client side. You don't have to do container.dataitem.name or evar of name. You just do name, and that works. And this is thanks to the dynamic nature of JavaScript. We had a few design goals for client templates. One of the first design goals was performance. How many of you have used XML script? 1, 2, 3, 4. XML script for the win. You love it? Yeah, well, so XML script was, for those of you who don't know it, which is apparently most of you, it was our previous attempt at the very beginning of Microsoft AJAX. We tried to have an XML-driven language that was kind of like XAML. It was our attempt at doing declarative programmation in JavaScript using XML. And it had one big problem, two big problems actually. It had a performance problem, it didn't run very fast, and it wasn't simple. It really wasn't simple. Here our two main goals are performance and simplicity. We want the template language to be very expressive, we want it to be familiar, very few new concepts, and we wanted it to be really fast, and I'm happy to say it is really fast. There is also the goal of security. We wanted it to make it natural that it prevents against injection attacks. If you look at most of the template engines that exist today that run on the client, most of them are doing string concatenation to build the HTML. So does that remind you of something? If you think of SQL, how do you build your SQL request? Do you concatenate strings? Do any of you concatenate strings? Yeah, you should hide. Nobody does that anymore. Well, that's not true, unfortunately. What you do is that you have a parameterized query and you use parameters. And what happens is that a kind of expression tree is being built with that request, that parameterized request, and the parameters go directly into this strongly typed construction from the query. And this is much safer, of course. And you don't have to deal with encoding because there is nowhere you need to encode. Here we are doing something a little similar in the sense that when we are parsing the template, we are actually building JavaScript code that will reproduce the same markup. And this is protecting from injections because when we set an attribute, it's not just that we do image, source equals, quote, plus your field, plus closing quote, and close the tag. Because then if in your field you have a closing quote, closing tag, and a script tag, you're dead. So you need to do some encoding. This is expensive. This is not foolproof. Do you do whitelist? Do you do blacklist? So on, so on, so on. Whereas here, we're able to do set attribute, and we just pass in the value. So there are still cases where you can do injection. Like, for example, you can inject a JavaScript protocol into a URL. But you're protected against other kinds of injections in a very natural way. We also wanted the template language to be compatible with XHTML. So some of you may not care much about XHTML, and some of you may care very, very much about it. So we don't want to force XHTML down your throat. So as you'll see, we'll have concepts of namespace declarations that are optional. You can use them, but you don't have to. And one of the results of this is that the markup for the templates is very designable, which means that you can open your favorite HTML editor, which is, of course, what is it? Visual Studio? Dreamweaver? It doesn't matter. You can use the one you prefer. And you can edit those templates. And this, again, contrasts with what most other template engines are doing, which is that they hide the template code inside of a text area, for example. And this is completely inaccessible to HTML designers. We wanted the data, the form of the expressions with which you inject the data into the markup, we wanted that to be as simple as possible. And as you've seen, you just put the name of your data column in there, and that's all you have to do. Which is made possible because the default data context is the current data item, and this is a top-level object to which you have access from your template. Another very important concept, the expression language is JavaScript. If you have a template engine, you'd better have an expression language because most of the times you will have stuff that is more difficult than just a name to display. Like for example, if you want to display a date, you don't want to just display the date as a raw string. You want to format it. You want to format it according to your culture, for example. And you may have much more complicated ways of formatting your data. And you need to have a reasonable language to do that. And we adopted JavaScript, which is a language that you already know, right? Except for, okay. We wanted it to be possible to intersperse code and markup, which means that you can do an if, for example, and have some markup inside of the if. And that markup will only appear if the condition is true. You can also loop over markup. You can pretty much do arbitrary mixing of code and markup, which is something that you may like and that you may think is absolutely horrible. Again, you have a choice. And finally, rendering HTML is just half of the story. What you really want to do is create active contents. So creating HTML is not enough. You want to create event handlers over that HTML. You want to instantiate components and behaviors. And we've made that intimately woven into the templating engine. So if we come back to the current version of Microsoft AJAX, it really is, you can see it as a component model for the browser. JavaScript doesn't have the notion of component. It doesn't have the notion of a class. It has very powerful features that enable you to simulate that sort of thing if you're interested in it. But it doesn't have the notion of namespaces, components, events, enumerations, properties, all that you have to simulate. And that's what the Microsoft AJAX library is doing in a way. So you have the notion of components, you have the notion of controls, which are components that attach to an HTML element, and you have the notion of behavior. And controls and behaviors are different in that you can have only one control per HTML element, but you can have several behaviors per HTML element. An example of that is, let's say you have a text box, and you want a watermark on this text box, and you want autocomplete on this text box. You can have both, because they are both behaviors. And it makes sense to have both. So the way you create a control or a behavior today is by calling a magic API that's called $create, and that is a shortcut for many things. So you do $create, you give it a class that you want to instantiate, and you give it a property bag, and it's going to set those properties, and you give it an element to attach to if that's relevant. And this $create instruction is exactly equivalent to the code that I wrote on the bottom of the slide, which is new data view, giving it the HTML element, set the property, and then call initialize. So this is how you used to do instantiation in Microsoft AJAX. And now we have this additional declarative way of doing things. And I show this in a moment. Don't worry about that. So now what we have more is that we have data view and data source, which come with the framework now. All right, time for a demo. All right, so I'll build this application from scratch, so almost from scratch. So this is the basic web page that a very talented designer, well, that's not true, that I built. And it's a very basic page. If I run this page, there isn't much to it. I mean, that's it. That's my UI. Now, I'm putting the hat of the developer, and now I want to make that page active, and I want to have it get data from the server. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to put the debug version of my script here. Oh, one very important thing. Notice that here I'm working with an HTML page, not an ASPX page. And this is to make it super clear that everything you're going to see is happening on the client. The only thing that's running on the server here is the web service. All right. So I'm going to take this very crude piece of HTML, and I'm going to make it active. All right, so that's it for the template. And then I'm going to instantiate, using $create, the data view component, like I showed in the slides. All right, so that's for the data view, and I want to set the data source, property, and I want to set that to a new sys.data.adonet data source. Then I want to set the service URI to AdventureWorks ADO.svc. And this is, I can show you this, this service. So this session is not about ADO.NET data services, but here I'm doing something you shouldn't do, which is that I'm exposing the whole database to the web services as a web service. And the model that I have behind that is the following entity model. It's always fun to open the entity designer. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. It's a slow laptop. It's a laptop that's slow, it's not entity framework or the designer. Or I should have opened it before. Apologies for that. And as far as my script is, so here is the model. So the table we are interested in here is the product table. So this is the service that we're querying, and the query that we want is, so as I said, products, product. And I'm going to filter on product subcategory, where product subcategory, ID equals 1. So here, if you're familiar with ADO.NET data services, you just saw me construct a regular query to the ADO.NET service. So here I just said select products where product subcategory ID equals 1. I'm done for my properties here. I have no events, no references to set, but I have an element to set. So I'm going to connect this to my product list view, which is here. And that should be it. Oh yeah, good call. Yep, that's a good call too. All right, so with some luck, there you go. Oh, did you see the template appearing? I forgot to hide it. So I'm just going to add sysTemplate, which is a class that I defined as hidden. And the template engine knows about that special magic class, and it knows how to remove it. So let's refresh that, and this time you won't see it flashing. There you go. But there is still some, thank you. There is still something that's wrong here, is that the formatting of my prices here is wrong. So I won't enter into details, but entity services entities are returning me for, well, ADO.NET data services for some reason are returning me a string for my price, which is a bug. So I'm parsing that, and then I'm formatting it. And here, this is something that you get from the Microsoft AJAX library, which is globalization support. So here I'm formatting that price as a currency using the local format for the current culture. This is something that you don't get from JavaScript. You get it from Microsoft AJAX. So here are our prices formatted correctly. All right, so this was a very simple example of a template. The next step here will be to remove that small piece of JavaScript code that we had. You don't have to remove that code. All component instantiation, all control instantiation can be done imperatively if you prefer that. Now we are introducing another way of doing that declaratively. That way is compliant with XHTML, which means that we are using that very underused feature of XHTML, which is the X, which stands for extensible, which is almost never used. Most of the uses of XHTML are really leveraging the fact that it's an XML dialect, so it's easy to parse. But the other important part is in XHTML is that it is extensible in the same way that XML is extensible. So, if you use ASP.NET and you use ASP.NET, you know that in order to use controls, you have to register them. So there is an equivalent concept here. The registration is done by declaring an XML namespace. So this is done by doing XMLNS colon the name of the namespace that you want to create, and you point it to a URI. And here we're using the fact that the URI can actually be anything that is a valid URI. And JavaScript colon something is a valid URI. The JavaScript protocol is perfectly legitimate in this context. And here what we put behind JavaScript is the component that we want to register. So here we're registering data view, and we are associating it with the data view tag prefix. So this is almost equivalent to doing a register directive in an ASP.NET page. Register source equals, and then you point to a user control, for example, and then you say tag prefix equals and tag name equals. To do the actual instantiation of that component, you use the special attribute that we expose, which is sysattach. And what you put in sysattach is one or more of those namespace declarations that you put before. So in our case here, we are attaching a data view as we registered just before. And then the way you set properties is by using, again, that namespace that you created. So all the properties for that component will be namespaced with the correct namespace for that component. And that enables you, for example, to attach the multiple behaviors that I talked about earlier. And you can even have properties that have the same names on those different behaviors, and they won't step on each other's toes. And this is how you can code a data-driven page without writing any JavaScript. So let's look at that. So here, I'll start by registering the namespace on the body tag. So XML, NS. So I'll start with the sys namespace. You don't absolutely have to declare that sys namespace. If you don't, we will just understand sys colon as the right thing. But if you care about XHTML, you should do it. So here, we're just pointing sys to sys. Then I'm going to declare my data view. And this time, it's going to be sys.ui.dataview. And the last thing I need to do is activate the DOM. So I'm doing this with sys::activate. So this is going to point the template parser to the right element in the DOM. So here I could use a product list view, or I could use a comma-separated list of elements that I want to activate. And here I'm just being lazy, I'm just activating the whole DOM, which won't be a problem for such a small page, but be careful with that if you have a larger page. So the second thing I'm going to do is go to this URL here, and I'm going to add a few things on it. Sys attach, and here I want to create a data view, and then I want to set a few properties on that data view. So the first one will be, so here, if you remember the previous example, I'm just redoing exactly what I did before. And here you see that I'm using plain JavaScript inside of an expression. Service URI equals, I'm just going to be lazy and I'm just going to copy this. And then the query. And I think I'm done. Oh, no, I'm not quite done. I still have JavaScript on my page. All right, let's run this. Same page. All right. Another concept that I really like a lot, command bubbling. How many of you use that on the server side? Oh, really? You should. It's really powerful. So what command bubbling is that it enables you to specify, to associate some commands with some UI elements inside of a template and activate your component with arbitrary UI and having a complete decoupling between the UI elements that will trigger the commands on the component and the component itself. So the way you do that on the server is that, for example, you create a select button and you put a command name on the button, which is select. And just putting that button inside of your item template in the list view, for example, that will be able to select that item in the list view. And the list view doesn't have to be pointed to this button or anything like that. Just the fact that this button is here is enough. And how this happens is that when you click the button, the command bubbles up the DOM until it reaches a component. Every time it reaches a component, it asks the component, hi, do you know about this select command? And the component goes, no, I don't know. Have a nice day. And the command continues to bubble up. And when a component understands that command, it says, oh yeah, thanks for the command. I'll handle it, and the bubbling stops there. So here we have the exact same concept, but on the client. And the syntax is quite similar. You create a button, and you add a sys command attribute that says select, and that's all you have to do. And again, you do that without having to write any JavaScript whatsoever. So I think we have a demo of that. Going back to my page, and I'm going to add Okay, let's add one on the LI so that you can click anywhere on the LI. And I'm also going to add a button for better accessibility because people who can use a mouse will be very happy to be able to click on the whole line. But if you're using a keyboard, you'll be happy to have an actual button. So let's do that. Button type equals button. Sys command equals select. And then putting the select text in there. And I think oh no, I'm not quite done. There is one more thing I need to do because if I select, well, now if I do this, it will actually select, but you won't see it. So I just need to add a selected item class to my data view, and I'm going to point to, I think it's my selected, yeah. So this is a class that I defined in my style sheet, and that just happens to use this beautiful azure color that you've seen all week long. So now I can click on an item, it selects it. I can tap to one of the select buttons, shift tab to go back. So I have a perfectly accessible list view here. And look, no code. So how are we doing on time? Okay. You've seen some simple bindings that only read the data once and just display it in the DOM. So those are the simplest kinds of bindings that you can use with client templates. We also have a more complex concept of live bindings. Those bindings share almost the same syntax as the WPF bindings. So if you're familiar with that, you won't be in unknown territory here. They're a little less flexible because they are live, so we need to be able to track both ends of the binding. But you can still do a lot of amazing things with them. And you can't just put them anywhere. So you have to put them inside of a tag or inside of a property value. And those bindings are really live bindings, which means that you don't have to go back to the server if something happens. You can stay on the client, no round trip to the server, and you can just have those bindings update the page live, so you can change a text box and all the labels that depend on it will change immediately. So I said that they are a little less flexible, but that's actually not quite true because we expose convert and convert back functions. And what those are, they are callbacks that will get called every time the binding gets evaluated. So that means that, for example, in the previous example where I was formatting the price, you will be able to have a conversion function that takes the price raw data and that formats it before it's being displayed. And let's just look at that. All right, so what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to put a span around those because that will be required by the live bindings. So I'm going to change this one-time binding by a live binding. Same thing for this one. And here I won't be able to use JavaScript here. I'm just going to be able to use this. Okay. And I'm going to add this conversion function. So I'm going to say convert equals, and I'm going to call that format currency. And that function, I'm going to write here. Yeah. Format currency, And it's going to do the same thing that it was doing before. So a convert function takes a value and returns the transformed value. So here I want to do parse float of value and then local format as a currency. And I think that should just work the same. There you go. So now the next thing I want to do is introduce a details view. So I'm just going to switch directly to the completed page here. So here I had a list. So my list view didn't change here. Well, you saw me change it actually. Then I'm adding a details view, and that details view is interesting here. So here I have the data property of my details view that is bound to the selected data property of my master view. So the source of this binding is the master view. I happen to have given a key to my master view here so that I can reference it in the details view. So here, if you remember the update panel example, every time you clicked on an item, you had to go back to the server to get the rendering for the details view. Here we don't have to do that because we still have the data as data. It's not just HTML. We have an actual representation of the data on the client, which means that when you select an item in the master view, we can extract from that the data that's associated with that selected item. And that is the selected data property of the data view. So we are able to bind to that. And all we have to do in our template is just bind to the different properties of our data item. And here that's an interesting aspect of data view, which is that if you bind it to a list, so to an array, it will repeat the template over that array. But if you bind it to a plain object, which is what we are doing here, we're binding it to one of the objects in the array of the other one, then it will just render it once. So this data view is both a repeater kind of control and a details view or form view kind of control. Yeah, and this details view is actually read-write. So I can actually edit the data item from this view. So I have input tags here that are bound here to the data. One thing to notice here is that the system is smart enough here to determine that if you use a binding on the value of an input tag, it must be both ways. It must be read-write. Whereas if you bind in a span, it will be smart enough to just do the one-way conversion. All right, so let's run this page. So here, I even have a little handler that's displaying the image of the product. So here, there is absolutely, I can show you that there is absolutely nothing going on the network when I do that. Everything's happening on the client. And my details view here is updating every time I'm changing something. And more than that, I can edit the price here. And immediately it gets repercuted to the master view. If I change so let's look at this one. So it says silver, it's actually red. So let's make this red. And it will change here, and it will change here. Okay. There you go. No code. No code in this page. And look at that. It's like, well, actually, yes, there is code. There is a conversion function. I'm cheating here. Almost no code. But look at that. It's actually quite simple. And if you go back to the update panel view, you know what? I think the update panel view is actually more complex than the client model. So I think today the client model has become even simpler than the server-side model. And that is in part thanks to the dynamic nature of JavaScript. So, what we've learned here is that it's easy to get data from an ADO.NET data service. All I had to do was point to the service, write a little query, and I was done. We learned that we can format HTML, we can format data into HTML, transform data into HTML using templates. And that is very, very easy, even easier than on the server side. We've learned how we can declaratively instantiate components. We've learned how we can bubble up commands. We've learned how we can have UI bound live to data. So ASP.NET AJAX development is really simpler than ever. And that's not all. We have a lot more stuff that we want to do. We want to enable sorting and pagination and filtering. We want to automatically send the changes to the server. So to add to send the data back to the server and send all those client-side updates to the server, I will just have to do one thing. Data source.save. That's it. We want to add more. I haven't talked about the AJAX Control Toolkit. The AJAX Control Toolkit is a very successful thing. And we have 3 more controls that are already in the process of getting in. There is a rich text editor, for example, that's being contributed by About, which is a very generous contribution. The AJAX Control Toolkit is very much alive, and it's going to continue to be very much alive. We're doing a lot of bug fixes in there. We'll also add stuff for search engine optimization. jQuery is also a very important part. We want to make the interaction with jQuery much better. And last but not least, we want to split the framework into smaller pieces. Thank you very much. So that you will be able to include only the parts of the framework that you actually use. Hopefully. You know what? I haven't shown enough. Let's go back. Last demo. And if you're not confused yet, you may get confused by this. I apologize about that, but I had to show this. So here I have a new version of my page. I'll just show you the page first. All right, so let me refresh that, start from scratch. Same page you've seen, except you've seen a little difference. You've seen a little animation. So let's say that I select a product here. All right. So I can still edit the product. And as I edit the product, every time I edit the product, small animation. I'll show you how I do that. And only the part that I change get animated. Another thing, oh, I just sorted. I'll show you how I do that. It's actually very, very simple to do. I can sort on name. I can sort on price. And if you look at this little detail here, the URL, the URL is changing. And this is actually an old feature. It's a feature that's in 3.5 SP1. It's history management for AJAX applications. And if I look at the history in my browser here, I've got meaningful entries in the history. And this is something that you can do today with 3.5 SP1. So let's take a look at the code. And I'll finish with that. So here, the way I did sort, I added a sys command sort. DataView doesn't understand that command natively. But I have an onCommand event that I can handle. And this enables me to add arbitrary commands to DataView. So I can use that command bubbling infrastructure and use it for anything. You can use it for paging, sorting, whatever. So here we're using it for command. We're just sending to a handle master command function. And here the argument of the command is the column on which you want to sort. So that's very simple. And if you look at the actual function that does the sorting, it's really interesting. So handle master command is here. It gets the command. Well, first it looks, do I understand this command? No? Well, have a nice day. Yes? Oh, okay, I'll handle that. So in the case you handle the command, you have to cancel the bubbling up of the rest of the command. But the interesting part is actually happening here. So in this sort master, this product query here, if we look at the declaration of that object, what it really is, it's here. It's an ADO.NET query builder, which gives you the ability to build your query for ADO.NET data services in a structured way. So you don't just concatenate strings, which we've seen is evil. You can actually build a command using a stronger object model. So here, I'm just setting order by on that query builder, and that's all I have to do to sort. And of course, I haven't shown the animation part. And for the animation part, I've been using a little jQuery plugin that's called JFade, which is very useful and very small under MIT license. And this is how I did the animation. But how did I connect the animation to the binding? And that is also an interesting part. If you look at the template, you can see that I have a convert function on the bindings that calls this function. So the convert function here is not actually converting data. It's being used as an event handler every time the binding is getting evaluated. And I'm using that just to flash the parts of the UI that changed. So that was my demo. And that was actually my talk. To learn more, I have a few things on these slides. So there is, you can download the latest previews from Codeplex. There is the official website where you can download the latest stable supported releases, which what I showed is not. So what I showed can be downloaded since Monday on Codeplex, so the first address here. The AJAX Control Toolkit is also on Codeplex. Sorry. Then there is my blog, Tales from the Evil Empire. And you can see that I'm really evil here because the link to Scott's blog also points to my blog. So here I'm trying to divert some traffic. Scott Hanselman's blog also points to mine, but it's a very interesting blog. And Dave Reed's blog, which also points to mine, is very interesting too. So Dave Reed is the dev, the very talented dev. Well, we have two devs. We have Dave Reed and we have Nish, who is also very, very talented. But those are the developers behind all that magic, and I wanted to mention them. And there is also an article in the October release of MSDN. So thank you very much. Don't forget to fill your evals. This is very, very important for us. And thank you. And of course, the session is available online if you want to see it over and over again, which I'm sure you want to do. So now we're open for Q&A. Thank you very much.
The first thing I want to say is that it's great that Microsoft is doing AJAX. It's long overdue. And second thing that I think is a little bit more controversial is that the last UI to data binding that you showed is really goes against the MVC model that Microsoft has been touting throughout the conference, because the controller is not there anymore. So I think you're going to make this too easy to bind again directly from UI to data in a browser, and I think it's really a bad pattern to facilitate.
Okay.
So the service paradigm is great. So you call the service you bind to the UI, but when you get this active binding going back and forth, you lose the MVC, and that means that you are violating all the principles of good design.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. I think you're wrong, and this is why. You can actually see those templates here as a view, and all we are doing is getting the data from the server, and this can actually come from a JSON result, as I mentioned before. So it's pure data, and all you're doing here is a view job. You don't have any domain logic in there or anything like that. It's really pure view, I believe. Do you disagree?
But when you change the data directly from UI without really going through the controller, I think that's where...
Oh, I see that part. I see.
Hello. Hello. My question is about search optimization. You skipped through it.
About what optimization?
Search engine optimization.
Oh, right. Okay.
And my concern is in general when you have an AJAX page, how search engines can index it.
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. It's something that we want to address in that release. There are several answers to that. What you really have to do if you want your page to be optimized for search engines is that the data has to be on the page, on the GET request, right, which means that it has to be rendered by the server.
Right. Okay.
So what we're trying to do is to enable the same model of the page to be rendered both on the server side and on the client side.
So basically, you have some engine on the server side that can acts like a browser and...
Yeah, so it can happen in two ways. The first thing you can make that happen is by actually rendering the template on the server. This is fairly complex because you need to run JavaScript on the server. Right. And the second way you can do that is having a server-side data source control that exposes itself on the client side as a client-side data source, but that's also understandable by the server side, and that's able to generate some search engine-friendly form of the data, even if that's not the form of the data that you ultimately use on the client.
So that sounds complex too. You think you're gonna be able to...
It sounds complex, but the goal is to make that as easy as setting a few properties on the control.
And the time frame for it, for this stuff?
So the time frame for it would be you should see previews at the beginning of next year for that.
Thank you.
Okay. I have a question about the comparison to the Ext framework. Are you familiar with Ext?
Not very much.
Not very. Some of our developers are using Ext to do data binding and stuff like you showed here. And the main difference is the outcoming UI is much better. It looks, like a real data grid. Are there any...
that's really my talents as a designer here that you see.
that's exactly what I'm talking about. Getting these things quick done is with a thing like Ext easier. I would expect Microsoft to deliver something for ASP NET AJAX just to plug in and look a little bit prettier than just what we normally see.
Yeah, so of course you can use CSS, but if I understand your question right, it's more about having some components that are already pretty when you put them into the page. So data view is a very basic control. It's a repeater type of control. So you're completely in control of the markup here. You totally control that, so that's a good thing. But on the other hand, it seems that you have to write all the markup yourself. So you're entirely responsible for it being pretty or ugly. And a more elaborate control, such as a grid control, which is something that I'm trying to get into the toolkit,
okay,
would address that problem by giving you a pretty by default component.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, my question is about the AJAX Pro library that's out there. It was written by Michael Schwartz. Mm-hmm. My team and I, we started doing development with the AJAX Pro library, and we kind of got forced to switch over to ASP.NET AJAX because
I'm sorry about that.
That library kind of went away. My question is, though, we've noticed using Fiddler that AJAX Pro doesn't create all the event state information and just generally transmits smaller amounts of data back and forth when you're doing the server-side model. I'm curious, have your developers talked to Michael Schwartz at all, looked at that library to seek out its optimizations?
Yeah, well, we know Michael pretty well. He's an MVP, and we talk. But if you look at the data that's traveling over the wire here, Yeah, so here, for example, you see what goes back to the server. This is in the case of an ADO data service, is just pure data, so it's exactly equivalent to what you would get from AJAX Pro. I mean.
Okay. So basically that's, because in the current ASP.NET AJAX extensions, it doesn't work that way. You get all this event state stuff that.
Yeah, so that's what I showed. That's if you use update panel, but actually you can call a web service. From version 1, you were able to call a web service in the same way that you can do it with AJAX Pro. It's just that this may not have been the approach that we put in front.
Okay.
And in a sense, it's a shame, but on the other hand, it enabled a lot of existing ASP.NET developers to get into the AJAX train very fast.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. I have
Hello.
a question. Yeah, we already have a web application built with this web forms and master page, AJAX 1.0 kind of stuff. I'm thinking of, is that possible, say for example, if some of our user controls or something we can refactor or recreating using this new AJAX client framework, is that possible to do that? And because I saw you did clear all the stuff under the the body and the stuff, is that possible to do that?
You mean with a master page?
Yeah, we already have master page and probably have several master pages.
And you can't modify the master page. Is that the problem you're referring to, or?
Yeah, we.
Okay. So we have a feature in the next release that addresses that exact problem. That will enable you in the script manager proxy in your content page, you'll be able to do some activation from there. And what it will do, it will generate the JavaScript code that will do the activation for you.
Okay.
So that solves that problem.
Okay, and also, is that not going to be conflict? Say, for example, if you have only one or two user control want to utilize this kind of client-side features, is that possible, or is that gonna conflict with the other, like so update panels or the other part of web forms?
In terms of IDs, or?
Yeah, or in general, is that possible? Any conflict or anything like that?
Yeah, I don't see why.
All right. Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
Hey Bertrand, got a bunch of questions for you. We built on the futures that are out now. The ones that had XML script. It's actually, the only complaint is what you mentioned, it's a little slow. But very powerful, so this stuff is all great. But, we did some extensibility on that stuff, and I kind of wonder where we're going to stand on these new bits, because really it translates very well from the XML script and the bindings that existed there and whatnot.
Yep.
So it's going to map over pretty easily, but some other things we did customize-wise, I'm just wondering where we stand. So, number one, control over the template processing engine. Used to be able to spin up a markup context of your own and basically tell it, hey, do me a favor, parse this XML script that we just downloaded and actually apply it to the HTML that came down with it. Are we going to have that same capability in the 4.0 template engine?
Okay. That's it?
No, I got a whole bunch, but that's number one.
Yeah. Okay. So number one and number two, apparently. So
Sure.
The first one was XML script and where do the old futures.
That's not even a question. I see it. It's pretty
so
parody.
the last version of the futures was in July 2007, and actually we have a new release that's ready now, and this is going to be the last one. So what we're doing is that we're putting that code on either Code Gallery or CodePlex to be determined still. And basically, we are not going to update that code anymore, but we want people to be able to continue to use it. So we are giving that code to the community, and anybody is free to use it, extend it, and whatever you want to do with it. But you won't get much support from us on that. Sorry. So the second question was
markup context equivalent.
Yeah. So here I only shown the data view component, but the data view component uses public APIs to do template rendering, and they're very, very easy to use. Actually, if you look at the MSDN article, at the time we didn't have the data view, and I'm using those APIs directly. And the reason why those APIs are completely public and made to be reused is that I've only shown the application developer scenario, but there is a component developer scenario that is very, very important for us. And we want component developers as much as possible to use that stuff so that the application developers don't have to learn a template language from Microsoft, a template language from Terry, template language from Component Art, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So yeah, that's the idea.
I'll defer so that he can answer.
Hi there. My question is about is there any thinking or working about making it easier to control where and when to load the JavaScript AJAX files in the page, or maybe having more control over compression, or where to load it in the page, like at the end of the page or wherever you need it?
Okay. Can I ask you a question? What do you think is wrong currently with compression?
It doesn't work in all browsers, so it only works in IE. And
actually, no. The only browser where it doesn't work is IE6.
Yeah, that's right.
And the reason for that is that there is a nasty bug in IE6 that got fixed. It got hot fixed, but we don't know that the patch is on all browsers. So we went for the safe route of not compressing for IE6. And we may revise that as IE6 becomes less important, but it still is today. Does that answer your question about compression? Or?
No, the other question was if we're going to have more control of where the JavaScript files are.
Today you have some control over that. You can put the scripts either at the beginning or the end of the form. So that's just some control, but it's not a lot of control.
Yeah, but when you're using just the client side of the libraries.
Well, if you're using the client side, you can put them wherever you want.
Oh, absolutely, but that's the way it's going to be. The RTM is going to be only a client version of the libraries, or is going to be also a server version?
So there is some server stuff that we're doing, but this release really focuses on the client model. It doesn't mean that you're not going to use a script manager, because today I've done all the demos in HTML pages, but that's really to make it super clear that it's happening on the client. But that's not typically something you would do. Typically you would still use an ASPX page, and you would use script manager because it's so convenient. But that comes with some restrictions on where you put the scripts. So that's true. So what is exactly the problem that you're facing with the position of the script?
In some cases where the client is like using a high latency connection, is facing high startup times for the page.
Yeah, so in that case, you should put the scripts at the end of the page. And there is a property on Script Manager that enables you to do that. It's called load.
It doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work?
Yeah, it always renders the JavaScript tags at the right before the form tag.
Okay, so why don't you send me email and we'll look at that.
It is a well-known thing, and there are articles that runs through some hoops to change that, but it's kind of a hack.
Yeah, well, you know, sometimes what you see on blogs is not exactly accurate. Okay, so let's follow up on that. I'll give you my card and you can send me email and I'll follow up. Thanks.
All right. Type equivalence across frames, because right now in the current futures, there's a lot of object equality checks. And so whenever somebody does a type of kind of check, if you actually loaded a separate AJAX instance into an iframe and you were trying to actually do some kind of cross-frame communication, it should just work. In fact, we've patched up the future scripts to just kind of do the type equivalence first using just equal equals equals, but then fall back onto what's the type's name and is it string equivalent, because I realize that's not perfect, but it solves the problem. Are you guys working on that at all? Because
so we've known about that for a while, of course. We are not doing anything in this release. We haven't had actually that much feedback on that.
Okay.
It's not in very, very high demand.
Well, you know what's nice about it is that you can load things into an iframe and it kind of gives you a memory sandbox, because when the iframe, if you kill off the iframe, it actually cleans it all up.
By the way, about that,
Yeah.
did you look at Scott Isaac's web sandbox that was published on Live Labs last week?
No. Oh, I did see it, but I didn't get into the details.
You should look at that. I think it's a more interesting way of isolating your scripts than using iframes.
Okay. I'll take a look.
Because it's specifically designed for security, whereas iframes are really just hacks.
Right, right. How does the live binding infrastructure work with pure JSON objects? I mean, you don't have iNotify property changed in that case, so what are you doing? It's kind of a geeky kind of question. I just want to know the details.
Look at the code.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So we don't wrap the objects really. What we do is that we instrument them, and the bindings actually know about that wrapping, and they know how to call the right APIs.
So you have some kind of dictionary by identity with some kind of wrapper.
Look at the code.
Cool.
What you want to look at is sys.observable.
Okay, right. History point coalescing, meaning I have n number of controls on my page. The user performs some logical action. Those controls in and of themselves may be using history, right, to track a change. And right now, as it stands, if one guy adds a history point and then another guy adds a history point, well, now that logical operation that was one thing actually ended up being two in the browser, right? Is there any way to, like, say, start, history point, start collecting history points and then stop?
I see.
You know what I'm saying? Because individual controls should be able to own their own history points.
I see.
Because we created like a,
So you have multiple operations that are happening. As far as the application is concerned,
the application says you do this,
it's an atomic operation, but for the component it's
exactly.
not. Yeah, that's an interesting scenario. We are not handling that.
All right.
Yeah, that would be interesting to look at.
And I guess the other ones are kind of what controls are there going to be out of the box this time? Because you had text box and checkbox, and those were great, but I don't think they're in.
You don't need them anymore.
True. They did add some nice features on top of things, but I guess you're saying that'll now be through the AJAX control toolkit.
Yeah.
Okay. AJAX control toolkit. Why is everything a behavior? It's like they totally misuse the concept when, like, something is a text box, that's the control, that's not a behavior. Watermark, that's a behavior. Are you guys working on that?
Unfortunately, I agree with that.
Yeah.
And there are a number of things that I think are not optimal in the toolkit, but that you have to accept some of that when it's
free. Yeah.
Not only when it's free, but when it's a community effort.
Okay. Last one. You showed a hack on the binding that you were doing the flash with because you were hooking up to convert from. It's a little bit of a hack using the convert from.
Yeah,
are there actually going to be any events that you can hook
to?
But
it's hacky, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's great. I was like, how the heck is he doing it? But are you thinking about exposing an actual event to fire so that it's a little more natural? Because as it stands right now, you'd only be able to hook up one guy to that and not multiple. You'd have to do chaining yourself inside the guy that you hook up.
So, yeah, that's true. It would be useful to have multicast events there, I agree with that. We won't have time to do that this release, but it would be nice to do.
As long as it's in
there.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.